I'm the director of the Harpst Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, and we sponsored this travel immersion entitled Catholic Perspectives on the Current Immigration Crisis. So we decided we would try to look at it from a historical perspective and a contemporary perspective. I always like to quote the great Harvard immigration historian Oscar Handlin, who once said, "I went out to study the role of the immigrant in American history. What I found was that the immigrant was American history." And I found that to be very true for the Catholic Church as well. I'm a Catholic Church historian, and I went out to study the role of the immigrant in the Catholic Church. And what I discovered was that we are and have been an immigrant church. And so we decided, what does that mean? And what does it mean in terms of the contemporary debates? So we began our trip in San Francisco, and the participants went to Angel Island and reflected on the whole experience of Asian immigration, exclusion, and other issues came up there. Then we flew across the country and went to New York City. And in New York City, we visited a couple of live parishes, one extremely large Latino parish in Corona, Queens. And then we visited a Polish parish, traditional national Polish parish in Maspeth, Queens. So we got a perspective on those two experiences. Then we went to places like the Center for Migration Studies, Ellis Island, the Cabrini Immigration Services, and a number of other locations, as well as meeting with a few Fordham professors. So in this whole encounter, we had 3 professors with us who are with us this morning. So we had Dr. David Miller of the Department of History. Dr. Miller is also, I refer to him as Mr. History, since he is on the radio giving all sorts of insights into San Diego history. And he is also the editor of the Journal of San Diego History. Then we had Dr. Esteban Del Rio with us from the Communications Department. He was also the director of the Center for Inclusion and Diversity. And then we have Victor Carmona from the Department of Theological and Religious Studies. And of course, overseeing us all was my assistant, Christine Watson, who handled so many details of this trip. So we're going to start with Dr. Miller to tell us about his experience and insights into this experience. So David.
All right, well, thank you for everyone being here and for that nice introduction. I guess it's all downhill from here since I'm starting. Yeah, I have to say, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, it occurred to me that I really kind of had to compartmentalize where I was and what our situation was. And I noticed that what I was expecting out of this trip and what I took out of it really changed over time. So, as the good historian that I am, I, had to contextualize all of these things. And so what I'm just going to offer for you is sort of what I expected to get out of the trip, how I organized it, what I've applied, what's changed. And what I like so much about the trip as well is, of course, as an historian, I was excited to see the historical sites. But of course, I was accompanied by wonderful colleagues who brought with them a very different, not so much sensibility, but insight in terms of an expertise in more contemporary immigration issues, more of an expertise in Catholic theology. So obviously, I'll leave it to them to talk about those things. But basically, how this breaks down for me was what I was expecting going into the trip, the pre-trip sort of imagination, and then where I was after the trip. And those were 2 different things. And then, of course, we have to factor in the COVID crisis and what happened before COVID and then what happened after COVID. And again, those are 2 very different things. So my initial pre-trip expectations was pretty straightforward. I wanted to get 2 things out of this. And one was content for my US history classes. I teach not just intro US history, which of course includes a history of immigration. It takes us right through, for example, the Irish and German immigration of the 1830s and 40s. But I teach a race and ethnicity class, so we cover the entirety of US history, which includes issues, of course, of immigration. And then specifically in the spring, I was teaching an upper division history of US immigration class. And so I was particularly excited to prepare for that. And what I really wanted to do was just get more content. go to these sites, talk to these professors, get insight, and bring back with me real tangible things that I could incorporate into my class. And part of that also included what I'm calling sort of immersion. I mean, I was immersed in this, but there's real value in going, I think, to historical places. And most of my students don't have that opportunity. I can say, you know, hey, if you live in the Bay Area, go see Angel Island, but most haven't. But to go to Angel Island is a very different visceral thing, especially when you compare it to Ellis Island, right? Ellis Island, you buy a ticket and it's all very public and there's crowds and everyone's excited, and you stop at the Statue of Liberty first, so everyone gets their, you know, injection of patriotism. And then you get off the boat and there's, you know, just this massive complex, and they've got a gift shop and they've got food, and I mean, it's just a whole experience. When you go to Angel Island, which is literally on the backside of the island, which is part logistics, part sort of accident of history, it's a great metaphor for how hidden Angel Island was to the American imagination, that you've got to go out of your way to get on a ferry to get to Angel Island. Once you get there, there are about a dozen other non-immigration related things you can do: hiking, biking, look at the old Nike missile sites. And you have to go out of your way to walk around the island. And then when we got there, there was nobody else there. There was no line. There was no food, right? We were, again, speaking of Christine saving the day, you know, she brought sandwiches for everybody, so we did have food. But you get there, and then there are fences and gates. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do for my students was capture photos and pictures to get a visceral sense of what Angel Island is. You get off the boat, and it's a straight pathway walk up to an enclosed, caged, almost like cattle chute that takes you into the building. So from the moment you step on shore at Angel Island, you are in a system that doesn't want you to leave that institute unless they are going to kick you out, right? It's not sort of like, hey, welcome, and it's a free-for-all. So you can teach that intellectually, you can write about that, you can make comparisons between the two, but to get that visceral experience is really what I wanted for my students. So I took a lot of pictures. I began incorporating aspects of the public history of these two places into my class. So students, for example, analyzed the actual signage that's at all of these places. How do they teach the history? How do they talk about it? How does that differ from Ellis Island? What does that mean in the American imagination, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really what I was hoping to get out of this, and I definitely did. A lot of content, a lot of firsthand experience, a lot of photographs. We did a wonderful walking tour of sort of the 5 Points, Little Italy area. And again, it's one thing to talk about a tenement, it's another thing to take a picture of it. And it was great when, you know, my students are reading a book about 93 Orchard, and then I can say, oh, hey, by the way, here's me in front of it. And there's a great little pastry shop right around the corner here. And they can appreciate it maybe in a different way. So that was wonderful. Then, of course, there's the post-trip, sort of what I took out of this after the trip that I hadn't been anticipating. And probably the biggest two for me were, number one, the impact of the Center for Migration Studies. It was, I mean, you know, academically, we're aware of these types of things, but to go there and to talk to the researchers and talk to the folks in charge and understand the history behind it, and then to come back and be able to have my students subscribe to their newsletter, use their materials for their own projects. I've got a student right now who's doing her senior thesis on contemporary immigration policy, and I, you know, immediately set her up with the people at the Center for Migration Studies. And so that was sort of an unexpected content bonus. And then in terms of, you know, beyond content, one of the things that I learned to do was to shut up, which is hard for me to do as a professor, right? Because when I walk into class, I tend to know a little bit more about the content than the students. And so I want to talk and I want to share and I want to say, you got to know this and this and this. And going through this experience and sitting down and meeting with, you know, with real people who are really living this. For example, when we went to both parishes and listening to the priests and sitting and having meals with them and having just sort of open conversation, what I really took from it was I needed to let go of the control and the expectations that I had in the classroom. Yes, there's content that they need to learn, but really what we're doing is we're setting up a space for students to explore on their own. And so I can set up the lesson about food and immigration, and I can show them the menu from Ellis Island, right? And I can sort of set up, let's have a conversation, but then I need to step away and I need to let students use that space to explore the historical meaning, the contemporary meaning, the religious and theological meaning. That's more on them. And so letting go was really, really helpful. And so I have to say, honestly, I joke when I say I have to learn to shut up, but it's really one of the big things I took from this is that this classroom and this topic is a space for students to explore and to reach their own insights and conclusions, and to be less focused maybe on, you know, the historical timeline and data points that I want them all to know. Then of course there's the issue of COVID-19, and you know, pre-COVID, the plan was to incorporate all of this into my class for the immigration class, and then. And I mean, I can remember it very, very clearly because it all happened so quickly. It was basically that 1 week in March where it was like, hey, this is on our radar now, be prepared. And then the next day it's, by the way, we're canceling classes. And then you have a week. I mean, it happened so fast. And before we left class, my students, I told them, I said, watch how this affects immigration. And in my head, I thought immigration policy, right? Shutting down flights from China, stopping, you know, closing the border. What kind of fears is that going to create? How does this connect to the historical fears of immigrants as, you know, vectors for pathogens? But where we ended up going with the COVID crisis, once we all got home and settled and back on Zoom, was the effect of COVID, which was already clear at this point, even a month or two in, the disproportionate effects that COVID was having on immigrant labor, or even sort of first and second generation. That there are class and race and immigration dynamics that were very clear very early on. And that's something that a lot of my students focus on. And then of course, the reality of the way that COVID affected where we were, you know, sort of the ironically named Corona neighborhood, was hit really hard. And so, you know, again, to let go and to say, hey, this is a place where my students now can think about, you know, real people. They just saw the pictures of the parish, right? And now 3 or 4 weeks later, they're reading in the news about hospitalization rates in that neighborhood. And so that really brought it home in a very human way. And one of the challenges I've had coming out of this is thinking about, how do I then, and we even had a little bit of an email exchange, like how do we leverage that? What do we do? How do we help? And that's really an open question that continues. And then the last thing I'll say is sort of now we're, you know, 6-7 months into this COVID crisis, and it doesn't seem to be going going away anytime soon. That 3 things that I'm sort of left with is, number one, again, the human story. That going to Angel Island was a way to humanize this history, for example, walking the neighborhoods. But COVID has also done that. And that's an important element, I think, that needs to remain in my teaching. The second, and I suspect Esteban will talk more about this because he brought it up, but that's involvement here locally. What is it that we can do as educators, as part of a Catholic institution to bring not just this education, but this action on immigration in our, I mean, we live in a border community. There's no reason not to bring these things together. And for me, I know that one of the interests I have in the Journal of San Diego History is bringing in more international and transborder scholars and doing more immigrant sort of historical research. And so that's one of the objectives we have at the Journal. My co-editor and I have been working on that. We brought in some people from UCSD and reminding people that the history of San Diego is the history of immigration and the border. And then last but not least, the thing that I suspect we'll talk about, but I have to bring it up, is the election of 2020. We don't have to get into all the politics of it, but there are, of course, issues at stake involving immigration and policy at the border. And what I think is fascinating is, in some ways, Christianity and Catholicism is under scrutiny and in debate because you have a potential Supreme Court judge whose Catholicism leads her one direction in terms of social causes and justice. And then you have a presidential candidate like Joe Biden or the Speaker of the House, who have a very different vision of Catholicism. And it's fascinating to me that my students, when we talk about nativism and the anti-Catholic movement, the 1850s, they immediately hone in and they say, oh, is this anti-Catholicism with Judge Barrett? And I say, well, we have to step away and think about, what does Catholicism mean? And I'm not equipped to answer those questions, but I think that that's now back in the public square. And that is something that is very much on the forefront of our minds, and it's going to connect right back to immigration policy. What is the humane way to have immigration policy? What does immigration reform look like? You know, you can say under a Catholic model, but under which? So that is that. So that's about 15 minutes. I don't want to take up too much time. I want to hand it over, but that's basically where I'm at this point. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We appreciate that. So now we'll go to Dr. Del Rio.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure to listen to David's presentation and reflection, mostly because I haven't heard his voice in a while. And I like it when you talk. You were my teacher on this trip. I was a history major as an undergraduate. So that flame, you know, was a little brighter spending time with David, but also all my fellow travelers. It seems like a world ago that we were a small group of us spending time together in San Francisco and New York City. In some ways, you know, I was reflecting on this, and it was almost like a kiss off to normal life, you know, this really interesting, close-knit, small, deep dive into things that I really care about. The plight of migrants, the opportunity to accompany them, how to historicize my own experience. Yeah, and then we returned, and within weeks, you know, everything changed. I'll end, you know, some similar thoughts and reflections that David shared around how Corona Queens and many Queens, working class Queens neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods were hit so hard by the, you know, the first peak of the first wave in April. We're now in the third peak of the first wave, so the beat goes on. So I'll be looking, I have my notes over here on the side. So I'll just briefly begin by letting folks know what I study and teach about. So my discipline is communication. I do media and cultural studies. I've spent most of my career thinking and teaching about the politics of difference, of how differences and unities are constructed broadly in infotainment, information and entertainment discourses. I do work that's kind of widely understood as Latino media studies, but really kind of what has driven my curiosity over these years is this idea about Latinidad, like who's able to construct what a Latin American or Latino people are. You know, under what conditions is Latinidad produced, and for what purposes is it produced? And migration, being here in Southern California, migration, this is my hometown here, San Diego. Migration is a very, very important part of the articulation of Latinidad, the way that a Latino people is rendered meaningful in discourses, the way that it is represented, the way that it's mobilized. Latinos in the United States are kept in close proximity to discourses of migration, even though we were here before there was the United States, and that the whole world runs through our veins, and it's a complex history. That's very much the history of the Western Hemisphere, as is written on our bodies, through race, through sexuality, gender, religion, but here in the United States, migration and immigration is something that is held very close, not just in terms of people's experiences, but also in the way that Latinos are meant to be meaningful. We are signified as a people as close to, as immigrants. And that's one of the things, that's really interesting if you look at some anti-immigration measures here in California. When Proposition 187 passed, which was an anti-immigrant measure, it was a strong, informed by a lot of nativist and xenophobic discourses. That was mostly at that time in 1994, about Mexican American migration. So, there were reasons why people like me, whose family came up from Mexico in 1918, I'm third generation, college educated, while we see ourselves inscribed in anti-immigrant discourses. We are implicated, even though we are not immigrants ourselves, we are implicated. So, I kind of came to this trip trying to use my experience here about Latino immigration, land-based migration here on the southern border, the way that Latinidad is rendered meaningful, and I wanted to historicize it. That was kind of a main kind of goal that I wanted to do. Is I knew a lot about what was going on in terms of Chinese immigration in San Francisco, also European immigration in New York City, but I was really interested in kind of historicizing it and contextualizing it. I was also interested in drawing some connections to my grandfather, on my maternal grandfather, Leonardo Fabbricatori, whose parents came from Italy in the 20s, and he ended up growing up in Newark. So I was really interested in kind of also thinking about him when I was in New York City. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then the third thing I was really interested in doing was eating really well in Lower Manhattan. So I had a New York. I gave myself a New Yorker subscription for a year, and all the tables for two. I used to live when I was in grad school in Massachusetts, so I had the New Yorker then, and we'd look at jazz shows and drive down to New York City. So I had a list of restaurants that I was going to try to sneak in late at night, sushi dining, and I did it, and it was awesome. So that was another goal. So, just on reflection, I think that one of the most important things that we did was that we started at Angel Island, and again, I think from, kind of where David ended and where I began, which is, being very familiar with, trans-border issues here. We are part of Latin America here in Southern California. People crossing is deep part of our culture here in Southern California. And I think that the way that immigration is discussed nationally, maritime migration is just kind of treated as a privileged space in history, with the Statue of Liberty and, various kind of European ethnic people coming through, New York Harbor and assimilating into whiteness. And that's, of course, very complicated, but that's a lot of times, the right way that migration is done. And I think going to Angel Island and getting a real close-up picture about the exclusion, like material exclusion of Chinese migrants who had to disembark on Angel Island. It's so different than migration from, Mexico and Central America. And also learning about, some Argentinian immigration that was going on in Angel Island. So just putting, I thought what was really important for it was kind of nationalizing the history of maritime migration. That California is a place, right, where with our own dynamic and problematic history where people entered, and I was just really grateful to get a very close-up look. That was an absolute treat, and I think that it's important to kind of widen the memory about migration, as Ron Takaki wrote, a larger memory. The book was really important for ethnic studies and history and otherwise. To create a larger memory about migration and to pull all of these things into kind of a unified discourse. So for me, that was very important to kind of nationalize, the history of maritime migration. Another thing that was really important for me, and this was especially true in New York City when we spent more time with in the Catholic parishes, but also with, Cabrini Immigration Services and the Center for Migration Studies, is to really kind of see the church as an agent of accompaniment, and I think David is exactly right, and especially with the election, with Comey Barrett's nomination, with a Catholic nominee, in Biden, all the Catholic people, people who are Catholic on the Supreme Court, with Nancy Pelosi, the Catholic vote is, the white Catholic vote is really in play right now, and I think that there are questions, like, what does that mean in a debate where migration and immigration remains a lightning bolt of nationalism, of xenophobia, of racism, and of fear. And I think that, spending time with parishes and agencies in New York City and listening to people about the work they're doing, this is where Francis's, preach the gospel every day, speak only when necessary, became so true to me. Like, the accompaniment of immigrants by Catholic agencies and parishes is just such a radical antidote to the questions of what we should do, or what does this mean, or what does it mean to be Catholic? From the parish in Queens we visited, which had 50,000 people it served, 80% of which are undocumented. Sitting down with that pastor was probably one of the most memorable experiences I've had in a church rectory ever. To hear that this parish was essentially a major social service agency for this community, and how hard it was, and how understaffed they were. Also spending time in the with the Polish bishop and in the Polish church, just getting a different picture about a deeper rooted immigrant community, and also some of the opportunities and challenges that brings to how a Polish immigrant community remains a Polish immigrant community when younger people kind of assimilate out of the Polish immigrant experience and into kind of broader whiteness, and through kind of generations, but especially at the Cabrini Immigration Services, and I was thinking a lot about them as the pandemic wore on, just the incredible work that people do, and the need in the community, and how they served everybody who needed support. And I'll just kind of end with, because I don't want to go on too long, but thinking about my grandfather, who grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and my great-grandparents who came over to Ellis Island fleeing abject poverty outside of Naples, in a rural community. I was thinking a lot about that. I was tempted to take a bus to St. Francis Xavier Parish in Newark, where my grandpa was an altar server and went to parochial school. His father died when he was an infant, with his sister on the way. He was killed in a streetcar accident. So my great grandmother was just, she worked in textile factories in Lower Manhattan. So I just got a real close-up look on that, and I thought a lot about it. My grandpa at the time was really kind of suffering in hospice care, and he passed away, I think, about a week after we returned. And so for me, the trip, in a personal reflection, I think I felt incredible connection to him and to his family by, spending time thinking about, we went to some of the churches that he probably went to during San Gerardo Festival. So that was really important to me. And kind of thinking about, the way that my great-grandmother from Italy and my abuelo from Mexico, who were about the same age, how they became friends as in-laws. And we would hear stories. I remember, I was old enough to remember it, but you'd hear stories growing up about how they would speak Italian and Spanish, and they would be friendly with each other. And what it just points to me is like the possibility for solidarity. Solidarity is impossible without accompaniment. It's impossible without accompaniment. So the more that we can build connections between immigrant experiences across ethnic groups and nationalities and across generations, you know, then both accompaniment and solidarity become more possible as we hope to, you know, support each other in a better way and build more justice for immigrants. Okay, that's it for my presentation. Happy to talk after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esteban. We're going to go to Dr. Carmona now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So let me do something here. I am going to share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Awesome. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture for the invitation. I missed the California part of the trip, and I was able to join in for the second 2/3 of the New York trip. So I'm grateful to them and to my, you know, oh my gosh, David and Esteban. It was such a wonderful experience and opportunity. So thank you for that as well. So I took a picture of this image at the Ellis Island Museum, and what you're going to see throughout my reflection is that I was really struck by that museum. Even though I had been to New York before, especially when I lived in DC for college, I had never been to the Ellis Island Museum. So this was a new experience for me. So I'm grateful for that. And what you're going to see is basically how I was struck by the way in which the museum highlights the presence of the religious dimension to the selection process and the way that the US conceives of migration in terms of its self-identity. So my reflection, I'm going to be focusing on these 3 moments. I've been thinking a lot about immigration as a selection process. And what I'm going to be doing is focusing on the specific case of the literacy test, which I came across at the Ellis Island Museum, and it just blew my mind. So these are the 3 moments that I'm going to be focusing on. So first of all, the background. So basically, whenever I do work on immigration, I'm heavily influenced by the work of Aristide Zolberg, who was a scholar in New York, scholar of migration. And he basically argues throughout his work that the US has always been selective. We've always been selective since colonial times in terms of who gets to come under what conditions. And in his book, he uses this term that just has been highly influential for my own thinking. He makes the case that we've managed to create a category of people who are neither slave nor free. So that image of neither slave nor free, it actually ended up being the basis of my dissertation, and it keeps influencing a lot of my writing. So the idea is that Congress basically developed the ability to attract some immigrants and to exclude others by forging mixed settlements between political, economic, and cultural interests with regards to migration. So think of it this way. We basically end up with a system where we have political mediation of economic needs and cultural aversions. And frankly, here by cultural aversions, I'm increasingly, especially in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement, I've been increasingly growing more convinced of my need to be more open and explicit about the racist underpinnings of our US immigration system, something that in graduate school I hadn't really given much thought to. So Zolberg uses these ideas of immigration regimes. So the idea is this: Congress basically sets a new regime in motion whenever there's a major need to resettle economic and social interests around migration. And he comes up with these 4 periods. And what you're noticing in the screen is how each of these periods are basically shifting the population that is identified by Congress and by economic and cultural interests as befitting the status of neither slave nor free. So we go from German indentured servants to Irish immigrants to the failed Chinese credit ticket system. I'm sure you saw some of that in California at the Angel Island Museum, to the Mexican guest worker program in the 1920s, to the current regime, which basically has created a category of undocumented immigrants who are neither slave nor free. So one way that I think about this in terms of my own writing and when I teach on immigration is by the analogy of a house. Now, I understand that all analogies break at some point, but nevertheless, it's useful. So when Zollberg is writing about this and others are writing about this, they use the image of the front door and the back door. But I think there's also a side door and frankly, the no door. So for example, front door, we basically have created policies to recruit and facilitate immigration by foreigners who we consider economically and culturally desirable. For instance, right now, if you can demonstrate that you're going to invest $500,000 or more in the US economy, it's actually quite easy to get a visa to be a resident here. Then we developed the side door, and that's basically for immigrants who are allowed and tolerated in, even if they're not culturally desirable for many Americans. And this is the language of the debates, particularly during the 1940s. So we tend to use this, for instance, for refugees, particularly during the Cold War. And then we have the back door. And this is the door that we use to basically recruit the help for the house. And those immigrants, we recruit them, but we also control them. We keep them under surveillance, particularly through economic means. And for that, these are immigrants, foreigners who we find economically desirable, but culturally undesirable. And then finally, the no door. So we're going to do everything we can to fully exclude immigrants who are both economically and culturally undesirable. Usually, the poorest of the poor can't make it. They can't take up the movement to the U.S. contexts. So this is kind of like the background that I use to frame my thinking on immigration and immigration policy. So the literacy test. So the literacy test is basically taking shape during the second regime, particularly in the early 1900s. And even though I had read about the literacy test, I frankly had never given it much thought until this trip. So the literacy test is basically reflecting this debate in the early 1900s around new public intellectuals, including in quote unquote new universities like the University of Chicago, where they really believed, and this was progressive thinking at the time, they believed that it should be possible to create policies that reduce the deplorable consequences of immigration while retaining its benefits. And here, to be blunt, they thought that it would be possible to develop policy tools that recruit some foreigners while excluding others. And then those that are recruited, especially if they're found culturally undesirable, they're recruited in the right way for ulterior economic purposes. So what is striking for me is that the academics of the time really took up the influence of eugenics and social Darwinism, and they really believed that there were some races, some nationalities that basically took on characteristics, moral characteristics in particular, that had to do with their physical and their social environments. And they really believed that these traits somehow entered their blood. And basically the question is, how do you handle those traits? Now, one of the presumptions was that quote unquote inferior races would actually prevail over superior ones whenever mixing of the races occurred, not just physically between spouses, for instance, but actually even socially. So the question for many of these scientists was, how do you keep the right kind of immigrant in, or welcome them or pursue them, and how do you keep the wrong kind of immigrant out? Or if you're going to recruit the wrong kind of immigrant to meet economic needs, when do you know enough is enough? How do you measure how many you can take in without having a detrimental effect on the American race? So here enters the literacy test. And what was striking for me is that in the research that I've been doing and the literature that I've been reading and following up on, this is basically coming out of the wake of the Chicago Haymarket Square riot, when a lot of German immigrants were rioting for rights, and as they were organizing for their unions as well. But in the wake of those riots, Edward Bemis, an associate professor at the New University of Chicago, basically conceived of this test as a way to facilitate the selection of some immigrants and the exclusion of other immigrants. And what's interesting is that he conceived of this test as a more practicable and palatable tool than raising the head tax, as many people of the time argued. Now, what's interesting as well is that a lot of the labor unions and labor union organizers and some of the business people also were interested in this test as well, because there was an increase in French Canadians in Quebecer labor, and they didn't want the competition. So the literature suggests that this test was basically a very good way of frankly enacting a racist immigration policy that was meant to do certain, to exclude the wrong kind of immigrants who basically were not Northern European. Now, what's also striking is that this test took over, I think, about 20 years in the passing. So the professor suggested it in the 1880s. It wasn't until 1896 that the test, about 10 years later, that the test gets approved by the House and the Senate, but then gets vetoed. And as you're seeing on your slide and your screen, this test survives and comes up time and again, and it's vetoed, I think 3 or 4 times by multiple presidents from both the Republican and the Democratic Party. Now, what's interesting is that I would argue that part of the reason that this test was vetoed by the presidents was frankly for partisan political reasons. They still needed the political vote, many of them, to survive, for their party to survive the presidency or achieve the presidency. But usually it was for partisan politics that they didn't approve of it. And yet, by 1915, a version of the test is again passed and then vetoed by Wilson. However, that last time, his veto was actually overridden by both the Senate and the House. So let me get into the literacy test itself then, these last four minutes. So the way that the professor thought of the literacy test was basically this. He argued that it was a good way of admitting no single person over 16 and no man over that age who cannot read and write in his or in, and here keeping the language, the original language, his own language. What's interesting is that he and those who supported the test knew that it was actually not going to be as useful as they argued for the purposes that they argued, but nevertheless that they really thought that it was a practicable way forward. Now, originally, the test was meant to be created in such a way that it actually included a text from the US Constitution. So the text from the US Constitution, a selection from that text was supposed to be given to the immigrant, and they would have had to read it at Ellis Island to demonstrate their literacy. In 1916, when the American Jewish Committee is seeing that the test is ultimately going to pass, They basically negotiated one last time and were able to have this requirement of the text of the Constitution be taken out in favor, quote, of text of not less than 30 nor more than 40 words in ordinary use. I've gone over I found the original bill. I saw a facsimile of the bill, and that's actually what the bill ultimately ended up setting. Now, let me show you what I found at the museum. And this is what just blew my mind. So let me share my screen, the other screen. Here it goes. Can you all see that picture? And my apologies for the quality of the pictures. Awesome. So what you're seeing here is the actual test itself. So the slip is in Persian, and it's actually a passage from Psalms. Next, let's see. In Serbian, a passage from James. Next, in Romanian, a passage from Psalms. Hebrew, passage from Proverbs. German, Proverbs again. Italian, Psalms. Swedish, Job. Polish, James. Armeno-Turkish, Esther. Greek, Matthew. Russian, Psalms. Hindustani was the only one that I could find there that did not include a passage from Scripture. So this is really doing a number in terms of my own research and my own teaching and my own work, because when I went over this history and when I realized that the text itself of the literacy test was actually no longer from the US Constitution, but the Bible, these are the questions that I'm exploring right now. So why settle on those texts? Who made the choice? Was it the AJC? Was it the Department of Labor, which is what the law established? What was the reasoning behind these texts? Was it simply that the Bible was the most widely known text? Why move away from the Constitution to this kind of text? Who selected those specific passages and why? Why are the passages different for specific nationalities? Are they playing a specific or an intended role in the moral and intellectual examination that the process is setting up? Is the decision simply practical, or is there a different ulterior motive? Were these the only texts? Were these the same literacy tests that were being used in the Jim Crow South? Why is the Bible being used as a tool of empire? Okay, these are just explorations. These are some of the questions that I left this visit with. And again, just thank you for the opportunity to visit the museum and be with you all there.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you for your observations. Thank you three for your observations. We're now going to open it up to general discussion and observations, but if any of the three presenters have something that they would like to say in response to the presentations, we'll start with you.
I would point out as general observation that we come at this issue in three very different ways, and you see that reflected in our reflections, but we're all talking about the same thing. And that's what I love about this. And I'm making notes to myself. I'm like, I gotta make sure I team teach with these guys. But I was writing down several things, and and a lot of this stuff obviously interconnects. And I was just thinking about, there's a lot of new work in the scholarship of San Diego's 20th century development, and I like the way that it really fits with the way that Victor framed this as immigration is being a way to mitigate or navigate economic and social realignments, and that in San Diego, there was a drive to develop economically in the 20th century, to develop industry and to develop jobs, but there would have been a social cost to that, and there would have, which would have been the presence of immigrants. And so the solution that San Diego comes up with is keep it south of the border. So the development of the maquiladora system and Tijuana and the border and the economy, that's directly related to San Diego. In other words, San Diego will take the economic development and will take the trade, will take the capital, but it doesn't want the labor, it doesn't want the people, it doesn't want the cultural change, and so there's a lot of work that's being done in that. And just the way you framed it, I think is perfect, because that's exactly what new scholarship is showing about San Diego's own 20th century development. So that's one thing that hit me. And I think it's, a place to explore when we talk about San Diego's position in these issues. And then the last thing I'll say is just, I think it's a great question you ended with, which I'm sure you did for dramatic effect, which is, why is the Bible being used as a tool for empire? Your dramatic rhetorical device flurry there, it worked, because that's a wonderful question. And what does that mean? Again, it gets us right back to this question of what is Catholicism, and what does it mean, and how are we interpreting it, and how are we using it, and how does that interact with immigration? I think it's a wonderful question that I'm completely unequipped to answer.
I'd also add, Victor, I'm going to make note of the scholar that the book that you referenced that had like the 4 stages. I've never come across that writer, and I'm interested. And again, kind of David's turn back to San Diego and the maquiladoras, and like just this idea that the city was just able to take the labor and not the people when it was possible, right? Of course that was impossible, because people are creative and they find ways to make to move and to this day and to the east of us here in the desert, there is no fence in many sections. There's not a piece of barbed wire. I have a good friends who volunteer with the Border Angels, and he sends me photos. We've pushed people to the most precarious position in order to come to the United States. We've pushed them to the point of death by essentially making them cross in the desert. If you're still talking about land-based crossing, we separate families and lose children and cage children as deterrent for people in dire circumstances in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Honduras. We're the United States is exacting the most draconian, unthinkable, tactics to try to, keep the situation where we want the labor but not the people. Can
I interrupt you here just briefly?
Yeah.
We have a question from one of the participants who's going to leave. So Evelyn, would you like to tell your question?
Yeah, and unfortunately I may have to leave. I just want to be conscious of that, but I did want to, my mind is going in a lot of different directions. But not being a Catholic scholar, but having been born Catholic, and whatever that means, because I'm not even sure that I am. And I know the good deacon will forgive me for that, because he knows where my heart is. So I feel really safe to explore that in this space, especially with scholars. But from all of your presentations, I can tell you as a theater artist, this is a lot of drama that could be staged. And hopefully one day I'll be able to do that when I figure out who I am, having been colonized a Catholic, but feeling very culturally connected to ritual and to notions of faith and belief in good, right? That we're all striving to be better, however you determine your higher power, okay? And I respect all of that. But I tell you one thing that really strikes me here before I leave. I want to get a sense from the scholars here. The whole thing of so I think it was Esteban who also mentioned the appointment of a judge who is so Catholic, and what does that mean? I think you've all sort of touched on that a bit, but my thing is looking into her background. Does she really do these fringe Catholics? Because I consider her denomination very fringe, and not that I am disrespecting that, you know, because I've seen, I think, you know, I've seen things with hands-on healing and with, you know, tongues. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I've certainly, well, I could share a lot of experiences on that too. But the short of it is, we consider her a Catholic. I don't really understand what that means, even less than what I understand what it means for me as a Catholic, right? So there's that. I mean, who has really some insight in understanding? I mean, I understand why she's appointed. I mean, we all do, okay? We all do. But I'm not quite understanding why everybody is calling her a Catholic. And maybe I'm just open. I just need the question amongst, you know, scholars whom I respect, right? And certainly Jeff bringing you together, you know, tells me that I should respect what you have to say. And I must say, I think I was really not, I was ready to just reject the church. And I took one of these trips, and it also made me, let's say, comfortable with saying, yeah, I am Catholic. I mean, but I'm still searching. And so that's the beauty of this trip, is that it did ground me more in a sober perspective, as opposed to, I was rejecting it. It was a time in my life I was rejecting it. I couldn't enjoy mass, but anyway, that's a different story. But so what is your feeling on that? Who has some insight on who this woman is? I mean, I don't really see her as Catholic, and maybe that's wrong.
I have just real briefly, you know, like I grew up in Linda Vista in a working class immigrant community. I grew up in a way that we were taught to have solidarity with farm workers. My father marched with Cesar Chavez, you know, and my sister, God bless her, is a kind of Coney Barrett kind of Catholic, you know. So her emphasis is on, you know, chastity, you know, for her daughter, and the differences of the genders. You know, she just went in a very kind of, you know, theology of the body, kind of politically conservative place. And so, you know, you know, without being a theologian, there's other people in the room who are better at that, you know, but so Catholicism is so much a matter of emphasis.
Yeah,
you know?
Okay, I understand.
And let me just say, for me, for migration, welcome the stranger, Matthew 25. Like, this is it's such a gospel mandate, you know, to welcome and accompany the stranger.
But that's actually not my question, although that's really helpful, Esteban. Thank you. Because I do recognize these more conservative factions, but she's in a very specific thing that, if what I'm reading is correct anyway.
Yeah,
that
I don't think you're really.
That trip was that there's not one Catholic umbrella. We're not one umbrella, and that gave me great relief. Right? There are all these factions that come, and they are wildly different, and yet we still consider her. To me, it was a cult. We still consider that a faction.
Well, I don't think you're giving her enough credit.
No.
In her faith, no, and the group that she was a part of, it's just a charismatic community, which many Catholics have participated in that. She just has a very distinct view of the faith and the church that's not what you have or what I may have, but it doesn't make her less of a Catholic. To me, it's the big tent Catholicism, right? You can have people on the far left, on the far right, and there's room for everybody, as long as it's an open discussion and dialogue and not one group dictating the other.
Well, an open discussion. Now, is this group of hers open? Because from what I'm reading, it's a little scary that they are not open. They're actually quite secretive, right? So that's what I read. That's what I'm asking you. You know, how
they're very good people. It's just, they may not have your political point of view.
No, I'm not questioning that either. I'm really not. That's not where I'm coming from.
I just wanted you to be careful to pigeonhole them into a thing because of People of Praise, I think is the group that she's a part of. And these are intentional communities back in South Bend. And they are a little weird if you ask me, but that's just me. But it doesn't.
They're not so secretive and cult-like. I mean,
no. You can go and mix with these people. We have when I was there many years ago, they had just started these communities, and they are a little bit different, but they're good people and they live really good lives, and they're concerned about different things that are of value. So I just caution you about pigeonholing them and saying she's a fringe when this is a person who's trying to live out her faith in an authentic way. It's just not the way that I would live it out, or you might live it out. So dealing with faith, I wasn't
necessarily pigeonholing her. That's why I put the question up here, because I'm not the only one that has that question. Yeah. You know, and I want to know, why are we still considering her a Catholic? And you're answering that, you know, and that you've hung with them says a lot to me.
I think that, my thing is I want everybody to do what they want to do. Just leave me alone. Let me believe what I want to believe too. And so I can advocate for things that they would say is wrong, but I can say, I don't agree with you either. And that's the problem for me in the church, is this at the top with Francis, you've got this call for dialogue, but does it really occur? You still have these people that are so judgmental and that. And so that's where we get into this whole difficulty.
Well, I would add to, historically, one of the things that's interesting for me is how this discussion about is her Catholicism, whatever that interpretation is, appropriate for her position politically, has turned since the anti-Catholicism of the 1850s. I mean, that was all framed by nativists as being fundamentally un-American and incompatible with American definitions and notions of democracy and representative government that the Catholic Church defined by nativists was problematic. Now, this more fundamental charismatic is being defined as fundamentally American and thus compatible. And so even the whole discussion about, you know, is this an anti-Catholic rhetoric? Oh, it smacks of the 1830s. No, it really doesn't, because it's completely reversed. And I think it's fascinating how, you know, Esteban, you mentioned, you know, this is Pentecostalism. It's a little bit maybe more conservative, charismatic. That's a Latin American thing, but yet she's this white middle-class woman from Indiana. And I'm thinking, you know, how does immigration and class intersect with your interpretation of Catholicism? And in this case, it doesn't quite seem to fit. It's an interesting question. And I don't know, I certainly can't speak the way that, you know, Jeff does about interpretations of theology and the faith. But for me, the observation is you know, really what's at stake isn't necessarily a national debate about Catholicism. It's about what is fundamentally American. Is fundamentally American, like Esteban says, you are accompaniment and you are social services and you are helping labor and is fundamentally American government relief programs like Biden want, you know, is fundamentally American what Judge Barrett wants. And all of those come back to a particular expression of their particular faith. But just some thoughts, just some observations.
It's also a particular understanding of America.
Yeah.
What strikes me as being so interesting in the current election is that the people who are being the most anti-Catholic are Catholics. The people that are attacking Joe Biden for his Catholicism most viciously are Catholics. And so you have this old dynamic where we all kind of bonded together. And now the church is split apart over these issues, so that anybody who attacks Biden's Catholicism is like, we're the real Catholics. He's not, which is, to me, is absurd, but that's just me. I don't know if that helps you, Evelyn, but.
It all helps. Are you kidding? Yeah, this is good. It all helps. Yeah, I'm not, and I'm not disparaging any of the Catholics that come under this wide umbrella, which I got to even witness in the Vatican, you know. But I guess what I was struggling with is someone that seems so, I mean, the group has been pretty politically active on things that should probably be separation of church and state. So that of course concerns me, but not her beliefs. I'll worship with anyone. I'll be just calling my God a different name, but to me it transcends language. If you're coming together to
well, I think there's enough for you to dispute with her over policy issues and
that's what I'm saying.
To leave the faith.
But yeah, they keep calling her Catholic. I'm like, wait, forget that she's a Catholic, whatever that means. Forget it. You know what? Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe someone else wants to enlighten me here. I just don't.
We all want to enlighten you, Evelyn.
I need it too. Save me. Pégame pecho.
Any other comments on that?
I don't know.
For me, what's interesting about the everything that's going on with the judge is that it also speaks to the tensions within U.S. Catholicism around how do we conceive of the norm of U.S. Catholicism, and because I mean I've said this elsewhere that we all know the demographic center of U.S. Catholicism is shifting from the northeast to the southwest. So increasingly, U.S. Catholics more tend to be Latinx Catholics or more Latinx Catholics, and the kinds of questions, policies, worldviews, the way that many of us pursue the task of discipleship in the political context is somewhat distinct at what the judge, conceives of, and frankly, the presence of the experience of immigration, I think, is much more closer to our hearts than it is for many Catholics over there. For instance, in South Bend, Indiana, most white Catholics tended to be descendants of the Polish community, a few from the Belgian community, but most were Polish Americans. And it was interesting to see the intergenerational tensions between them, where the grandparents wanted to still go to the churches where they grew up, but now those churches were full of Mexican American immigrants, and the churches were beautiful. They were actually like Nuestra Gente were cleaning them up, repainting them, giving them a manita de gato, and like the churches were alive again. But then I remember some of these folks, some of the grandparents would come back to the parishes and want to do their weddings for their grandchildren, and push out the Mexican American weddings over the weekend because it's our church, we built it. And those tensions within U.S. Catholicism are very interesting to me, and I don't know. I wish that the judge and other Catholics, from that part of Catholicism, I wish that they remembered what it's like to be an immigrant, and closer to the immigrant experience than what at times they seem to offer or suggest. But that's just a wish as a brother in faith, But how they do this.
The scholar Brett Hoover uses the term immigrant amnesia.
Yeah.
That they've forgotten their immigrant past, and I know that's true with contemporary Catholics, contemporary Americans, right? The history of 6 minutes ago.
And that actually, I think, gets back to maybe what one of the things that Esteban was talking about in terms of Latinidad and how do we define it. There's one of the things I was struck by in that Polish parish, that there's this maintenance of that culture and that little ethnic community even 50, 60 years on. But one of the reasons I think that's able to exist is because there isn't, since the 80s at least, a wave of more Polish immigrants. And so long as there's a Latin American immigration, Latin Americans aren't thought of as a frozen group in the past. It's a dynamic, it's an ongoing, there's a continuity, and maybe that prevents Americans from I should say maybe white ethnic Europeans, if there isn't that ongoing immigration, that allows them then to freeze it in the past and maybe allows for that amnesia to occur in a way that doesn't with Latin American, precisely because it's ongoing.
I mean, there's a Latina theologian. Her name is M.T. Davila. And I'm also thinking of this in light of the work of Greg Prieto at USD. There's, I think, reason to be increasingly concerned with US Latinx peoples starting to get into this amnesia. I think we're starting to see it. Sometimes I see it among our students at USD. And, you know, this is where I think the work, you know, like altares de muertos and like all of these things that I think USD's, you know, the Latinx scholars are at USD are trying to do. I think this is kind of a very important stopgap measure to try and make sure as much as possible that we don't go through that amnesia as Latinx Catholics, because it's a concern, because there is evidence that we're starting to suffer that amnesia as well, especially as we go up in the middle class.
I think that's so true. And, you know, like the idea that we could be we're the next Italians, we're the next, you know, whoever, it's starting to really play out in a hyper divided national conversation where you see, you know, greater share of Latinx voters moving to Trump than I think a lot of people expected. The threat of assimilation in immigration discourses is always there for those communities, especially if you could pass. And our system says, hey, if you could pass, come on in. There's a lot of benefits, you know, and there you get into some of the anti-Blackness within, you know, Latin American communities. Like, if you could pass, why not walk over that bridge? There's a lot of benefits, you know. So that is, and that breaks the solidarity with the new immigrants. I think that within Latidata, and this is the same for other groups, you have to opt into, a lot of us have to opt into solidarity. We have to make the choice, because there's a lot of pull into choosing the opposite of walking away from the community, denying your own family's history, denying how you're seen by others, right? Of course, others of us can't pass. You know, it's a lot harder. But that is happening, I think, now more than ever. And all the more reason to kind of build a thicker, larger immigrant narrative that we can see the connection between our families and what people are experiencing now.
I mean, for me, I think that was part of the reason that I was so stunned to see the Bible being used as part of the literacy test. Like, I mean, just seeing how the Catholic faith can be used as part of that process of assimilation. And look, I mean, as a moral theologian, I try to be as careful as I can around this notion of intentionality, of moral agency, of intent. I don't know if that was the explicit intent of the people who decided to use the Bible. I mean, and as a scholar, I also need to give them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps it was just easier and more practicable to have access to a text that has already been translated to most of the languages of the immigrants who were coming. And yet, as a Latino Catholic, I'm also mindful of how Catholicism in the US does have this ugly side. I mean, I have been to Mass here in San Diego growing up, and I've been to places where people will not extend, you know, the peace of Christ to me when they hear me speak Spanish, or when they, you know, hear me speaking with an accent. So I'm very much aware of how Catholicism and even the Bible can have that use. And that worries me, you know, and again, just for me seeing those texts, I was just, like, just how far back this goes. I had never seen it in such a physical way. And I mean, this is going to sound a bit corny, but it pained me also as a Catholic theologian, it pained me because I love my church. It's as screwy as it is, but that's part of it as well, I think.
Thank you. One of the positive things I took away from the trip, and which Esteban mentioned, was the church is acting as a major social service agency, or providing for the people, accompanying the people. And I think historically that was what the parish did. In the 19th century, Catholic urban parishes really were centers of immigrant communities, and they provided all sorts of services to them, from jobs to banking to other things that helped them navigate this new world, and that the church was at the heart of it. And I think that in the modern church, the best parishes are still the ones that see themselves as accompanying the people and helping them navigate this very complicated world. We had Bishop Mark Seitz speak a couple weeks ago. Look it up on the University Ministry YouTube channel. Just a superb talk about what the church should be doing right now in the midst of COVID, in the midst of the migration crisis, with the people on the border, and the respect that he has for each person. And what he says, the church's great gift is to tell every person that which the society discounts, that they have value. And so I think that's really what we want to create, a church that does that, values people and encourages them to understand that they are valuable. So check that out on YouTube. Again? Go ahead, Evelyn.
Name again?
Mark Seitz, Seitz. He's the Bishop of El Paso.
Yeah, he also wrote a recent piece on America Magazine that I assigned to my students on the problem of single issue voting. So I can't recommend that piece enough.
Sounds really good. I'm going to hit you up for that.
And there's also some pieces that you might, there's one by a theologian out of Villanova. His name is Massimo Fagioli. And he wrote a piece on America Magazine also, I think about a month ago, on the theological questions around the people of praise that you were asking about, Evelyn. So I encourage you to read that piece. And it gets to David's question, David's whole point about whether raising these questions falls under the purview of anti-Catholicism, and Fagioli argues that no. So it's a very good piece. I also recommend that.
Thank you.
American Magazine, right?
American Magazine, yeah.
Great. Awesome. See, I knew I'd get some perspective here. Now, what are we going to do with the immigrants that are being held hostage in Virginia? Oh my God, what are we going to do? But we can't. Yeah, there's a lot of work. I'm appreciative that we can actually criticize our own church. So maybe the only reason I don't leave Catholicism, because, seriously, like I've seen people in witches' costumes come to Mass on Halloween. I'm like, that is cool. We are evolving. No one's perfect. No one can promise perfection, But if we could keep criticizing, that's pretty good.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left, so I'd ask our distinguished scholars if they have a final statement that they would like to make.
I'll go real quick because I only have 3% left before I have to change computers. Unless I get cut off in the middle. But, I just think that, the project that I hope to take up for this is to actually create a travel course, to take students on this same journey of understanding the present issues surrounding migration, economic, political, and cultural, and historicizing in ways that we can build broader connections between ourselves and the people who are experiencing migration now, and our the bigger national identity that should arrive out of that. So that's really what I want to do. And yes, the dining menu will just only grow in promise, but I really want to invite all of us to kind of think about how we can bring the experiences of migration and the dynamics of migration, you know, into our teaching and our writing as a fundamental kind of challenge facing, you know, human collectives, to how we lift each other up and create opportunity for each other, and recognize and manifest the humanity in each other.
Amen.
That's great. I'll go second, Victor, so you can have the last word, because I suspect you're going to have better things to say than me, but I'll leave you to be the cleanup hitter. But I like that idea. And I was thinking, one of the problems I had in creating a travel course is that it's not summer school on campus, and it's not study abroad outside the country. And this is all theoretical now anyway, because we can't go anywhere. But I think it's a fantastic idea. Get students out of San Diego, and, you know, whether it's just down to the border, up to San Francisco, wherever, and see these things. For me, I echo that same idea about bringing this into the classroom and generating these discussions and this learning. My whole mission in teaching US history is to problematize it, and to make people uncomfortable, but then to offer them some comfort in an understanding of that problem. But once you problematize the history, then you can start thinking about the consequences of those problems. And then you can start thinking about contemporary issues and how do we solve them. But that's all rooted in an understanding of the past, I think. And so for me, what I'm leaving this with is, where does this conversation continue? You know, does this conversation continue in theological circles? Does it continue in social services and where we're doing our work? Does it continue intellectually and academically in these journals? Does it continue in the classroom? And maybe the answer is all the above. But for me, that's really sort of why I'm like, where do you have this? You know, and it's you know, it's not Facebook. I know that answer. But that's really what I'm going with taking away, is where do we continue to have these conversations and do this work, and what places and spaces?
Thank you.
For me, this visit and the conversations that I had with, you know, everyone, you know, who went on the visit, it leaves me no doubt that oops, sorry, I lost you. Let's see, are you still there? Yes, okay. This visit leaves me no doubt that, I mean, the University of San Diego has an amazing, we have faculty who are doing very interesting and important work around immigration across multiple disciplines. I think that is rare for a Catholic university, particularly. It's rare for a Catholic university at a border, at an international border. So I want to keep us encouraging to, I want to keep encouraging us to develop the kinds of courses, perhaps even in a coordinated way, that offers this service not just to our students at USD, but to students at other Catholic universities across the US and beyond. Because we do have, again, we have the faculty for it. We've got people who are doing very interesting stuff that if we could manage to pull some interdisciplinarity off, focused on the realities of migration, I think USD has a lot to offer to our students and other students beyond our walls. So thank you for the opportunity again to be a part of this.
Well, thank you to all of you for participating and making this such a great trip and great reflections. Thank you to Christine for all of your good work and making this come to fruition. Hopefully we'll see each other in person one of these days. We can think about future travel trips.
Miracles of the church.
So, but be well, everyone. Thank you very much. And we'll see you hopefully soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.